Welcome to episode 16 of the DWRDNET Stationery feed. Today's guest is Matthew Chen of Matthew's Nibworks. Welcome, Matthew, and why don't you give yourself, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Hi, I'm Matthew Chen. I'm a nib grinder from the LA area. Been going to a lot of pen shows, so you might have seen me there. Known for my Nagahara specialty grinds, which I learned from Nagahara Jr. himself, like the Kodashi, which is his version of Naginata Togi. Nice to meet you.
No, that's great. Great introduction. So, to get started, I have kind of the level setting questions that I've asked all the guests. So, to start off, what do you have inked? What have you been writing with lately?
Main one that I have inked, well, I got a couple. Main one that I carry on a lot is my Hakase. It's an extra fine, and it's got, I think, Kompeki in it. Let's check my
Always
list
handy
of
to have the
currently
currently inked
inked,
reference book.
if I can find it fast. I have Sailor Soten in there. That's a classic. Okay. I've used that ink a lot. Oh, I'm out of focus. I've used that ink a lot in my school days. And I also have a Namiki Emperor that's been inked for a bit. That one has, let's see, immediately lost the page.
It's kind of how it works, isn't it?
Kobe Romanesque Blue, which is a blue colored, I guess, after Kobe University.
Very cool.
Those are just two of the many. I kind of just have
how
a
many
bunch
do you
inked.
keep in general? How many do you keep inked at a time? Ballpark.
I don't try to maintain numbers, more of whatever interests me at the time. There are some that I consistently keep inked, like the Hakase or my 845 that I bring to a lot of places. This one's got Kompeki in it pretty much permanently. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, 14. I think I have 14 or 15 inked right now.
Okay. I'm about 25, I think, so it's not terrible. But, so in terms of pens, if money is no object and someone could hand you any pen, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a hard one, because I kind of already have.
Well, I was going to say,
expensive one.
You're currently inked writing pens or most people's grails, so
yeah,
with what you do for a living, that makes sense, but there's probably always that one out there that's just like, even if it's one that you're going to end up getting at some point,
It's not, okay, it's not it would be a custom pen.
Okay.
Because in my profession, I handle a lot of pens, so I kind of get to try a lot of the fancy stuff already. So that kind of dispels some of the myths, or I guess whatever you call it, of like seeing something but not being able to touch it.
You actually get a chance to hold it, even if it's someone else. Someone else has it, and if they're bringing it to you, It might not be writing the best anyway, so it's needing some work.
Well, the thing with Nibwork is I kind of accept that any pen that comes out of a factory always has a chance of needing nib work. So even if it's a super expensive pen, like the Namiki Emperor, there's always going to be a chance it needs nib work. And because I can fix it, it's not really an obstacle for me. So yeah, like the fancy stuff needing nib work doesn't really bother me. It's more about build quality, mechanics too. Like the old Mont Blancs from the 50s that had the telescopic pistons, those I find really cool. So I've got a couple of those. But in terms of Grail pen, I'd want something custom made. And I think I already have something sort of in the works, like a body by Sean Newton, and some Urushi work by Pokemondo.
So I've interviewed Chad. Are you going to get a clone of what Chad did with a pelican nib, or a little bit different variation?
Different body shape, more to what I want, because I like the Ohashido shape. I tend to prefer pens that have a step down at the cap, because that means the step of the grip section will be much shallower. Unibody designs that have like a flush body when they're capped always tend to have a bigger step, and I don't really like feeling that step. So I
Gotcha.
prefer it to be like this, and I like how it's meant to be posted. So something similar to this kind of design. Um, Nothing too big, because even for me, like the 149 size is too big for my hand. I have one and I don't use it enough, so now my dad's borrowing it. Um, but at the same time, this giant thing still feels good in my hand because it's lighter than the 149, but I still prefer like a smaller, reasonably sized pen.
No, that'll be interesting to see because Sean does great work. I have a prospector and an Eastman, so definitely look forward to seeing that probably at Arkansas or something in the future. But in
Probably for
terms
the,
of,
I have no idea when you'll get to it.
well, yeah, eventually. So you already listed what you had ink wise in a couple of your pens, but in general purpose of, or in general sense of ink, do you stick with the same inks all the time, or do you like to experiment with different brands and colors?
I There's some inks that I gravitate back to or default to. Um, Mostly Sailor inks and mostly blues, just
Okay.
because I find those more usable. I do have like other colors like reds, purples, some greens, but I just don't feel like using them as much. So it's mostly like sky blues. You can sort of see on the currently inked list how a lot of it is
Definitely.
blue.
Yeah. So follow up question just that popped in my head. Considering what you do, what's the ink you use when you're grinding? The dipping ink you use when you're doing your nib work?
I use this giant thing of Pelican Blue. Because they come in these massive bottles, I could just keep on refilling my smaller ink bottle. And it's sort of washable, so my hands clean more easily. Even though I have a soap that cleans off ink really well, I use lava soap. Um, Scrubs off ink really well. So if anybody wants a good soap to clean their hands of ink, lava soap is what I recommend.
No,
I just
lava stuff
happen to
is
find that
good.
it works.
I've used that when I'm not a mechanic, but I do some stuff in the garage, and lava has always been one of those that it's got some grit, but it definitely does its job well. So, what about papers? Do you have a certain paper style you like, or certain brands? What do you like to write on?
I use a lot of Life paper. So Life Ramune, I've sort of been using as a scribble notebook. This one's all full. Sometimes I use for testing nibs. I also have a Midori block of paper, this giant thing.
I have one of the blocks, the MD blocks.
That's just really convenient to like scribble on and rip and throw away. Because I tend to not really keep what I write too much, because most of it's testing. So I scribble then toss it. It's also why I like the plotter type system where I can just refill the pages as I need to. But the paper that I really like is Graphilo. And these are refills I've got. Oh, come on, focus. It really does not like focusing on me. Uh, this is little refills. I use Graphilo paper that I have for my plotters and system techos. Graphilo is not that common in the US. It's sort of, Kobe has a company that makes it, and it's their top of the line brand, which they sort of baby and control who can use the paper. I kind of have to get as much as I can and bring it back and then ration it here.
Well, at least with your pin show travel schedule that we'll touch on a little bit later, you do
Yeah.
travel more than most. So getting a refill on paper is probably not all that far away versus trying
Yeah.
to order international and deal with shipping and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So to go to my favorite question that I've asked everybody, what's your favorite stationery adjacent item? Be it a case, a book weight. What's your favorite? Not pen, paper, or ink, but something you use all the time.
Ooh. Would a pen case count? Because
No,
I
I mean
technically it's
pen case.
used.
I've had some people say they're rickshaws. You just mentioned plotter. It could be the cover, the system. That's technically, things like that. It's kind of an open ended question. it's a good way to find those kind of quirky things. See, like mine is the Good Made Better book weight, the travel book weight. I use
Okay.
that thing all the time because I like to write in hardcover journals, and to hold the pages flat, since I write in tiny print, I need that to kind of hold the pages down. So it's just a way to find those kind of quirky adjacent items.
Yeah, the prototype system, I guess, is one that I really use. This is not Blotter. This is Relio, but same thing where it's the ring bound kind of notebook. It lets me set it up however I want. This one's got much thicker rings than the standard blotter size, so I can put a lot more in there. And it's got pockets on the inside and outside, so more useful. So that's one thing, I guess. And then I guess pen sleeves. I have a friend in Japan that made fish themed ones,
That's
so
cool.
fish kind of just goes in the back right there.
I
I
like
put a
that.
little hook on it so I can dangle it around. Yeah, I guess that counts.
I feel like I need to see you walking around a pin show with like three or four fish pin sleeves hanging from a lanyard with different
I,
pins in it.
I've only got one of these. These are Pacific Saris, but I'm hoping to get more when I go back to Japan in November. So maybe she'll make some extra for me to sell somewhere.
No, that would. It's that kind of unique, quirky thing that people love. You know, finding the weird kind of unique thing that is going to
She made
stand out.
a whale pouch too. A big pouch. It's
Oh, I
just a
like that.
whale. They just
Yeah.
stick a bunch of pen pouches in, or even stick the poor fish in.
No, definitely. I love that. So let's move on to the main part we have you here to talk about today about you know your nib work and kind of how you came to get into that. So to get started, when did you first get into pins and pins and stationery as a whole?
Around 2015, that's when I started using fountain pens. I was taking art classes at the time, and my brother was using a Lamy Safari, and I kind of wanted to try out how those pens work because I was trying out different mediums at the time. And I had some cheap Yafa branded pen that worked okay. And then I got a Lamy Safari in charcoal when I visited Berlin. Um, Used that for a while, and then I started going down the rabbit hole that was FPN and looking up vintage pens because that was a way to get gold nibs for less than $100. Because high school student at the time didn't really have money because I didn't have a job. Uh, so, and I also had a bit of a habit of DIYing stuff. So repairing vintage pens was the obvious path for me there. And I had Fred Krinke's shop that was sort of close by back when he was around. It was like a 5-minute drive for me, so I could get the supplies I needed to repair them. So that's kind of how the ball got rolling.
So you started with using. At what point did you decide, I like this, maybe I want to learn how to do nib work and whatnot? That kind of was the starting point that led you to where you are today.
So 2016, senior year of high school, we had to do what they call a senior project. We had to interview somebody in the career field we wanted to go into. And at the time, I was having fantasies of doing vintage repairs, whatever. And the LA Pen Show was around the corner. So I asked if I could go to the LA Pen Show, and I asked to interview Mike Masayama there. And he let me. So I sat behind his table while he ground. I asked him questions on his business. And that's sort of where I discovered that nib grinding was a separate thing from just vintage repairs. That was like a whole separate business that was viable. So I did the project on that. It was mostly about vintage repairs, but that started getting me interested in nib grinding. And I guess I was starting to get bored with the pens I had. So the next obvious thing was fiddle with the grinds and see how I could make them more interesting for myself. And so that's how I started to experiment with grinding on my own.
Okay. And then when did you move to the next level of, so we'll just let's take a step back a little bit. Kind of talk through just how you progressed from learning about it yourself into apprenticing and learning from the your path. Just kind of talk about how that kind of you interviewed Mike Asiyama, and then kind of walk through your education of nib grinding. Um, how you got started in a more formal manner.
It's a very fragmented path, and it's not exactly a proper apprenticeship. So when I went to college, I wanted to study abroad at a Japanese university, but didn't get in. So the path was go to a American university and then do a study abroad program in Japan. And my major was Japanese language and culture, so that made me study abroad for longer than usual. And while I was there, I met Stilo Art again because I met them at the LA Pen Show when I already interviewed Mike, and they invited me to their place, and they showed me how to create a pen body out of wood on a lathe. So that started my relationship with them, and then um, when I went to the Kobe Pen Show in Japan, I tried my own attempt at a Nagahara Naginata Togi, and I brought it to Nagahara at the Kobe Pen Show, and I asked him what I could improve, and he sort of showed me some things here and there that I could do, and I went back to my apartment that night, did what he told me to do, brought it back the next day, and I guess me doing what he told me to do the following day impressed him enough that he told me to sit next to him, and he showed me how he would fix it. That's when I started changing my setup to be more like Nagahara's, and started getting my dad to design and build a rig that could pretty much do what Nagahara's rig did. And each time I was able to catch Nagahara at a store event in Japan, I'd bring a new iteration of my attempt at the Naginata Togi. And then he would sort of advise me on how to improve those. Then in 2008, Nagahara was set to go to the San Francisco Pen Show. He needed a translator, and so Stilo Art talked to Kaoru-san of Boombox, and they suggested that I could be a translator for Nagahara at that show because I already knew Japanese terms for fountain pens, so I'd be better suited to translating fountain pen stuff for him there. And so when I translated for him at the San Francisco show, Mike Masayama saw that I had made connections in Japan, and I guess he saw me worthy of using his grinding wheels. And because I had already started designing a machine that could use Nagahara's, that could be like Nagahara's, it fit the grinding wheels perfectly. So that's kind of how I got my current setup. But as you can see, it's not
Very neat.
exactly an apprenticeship. It's more of I kept on bugging him whenever I could, to the point
Oh,
that
but I mean that to me that shows you were motivated. You wanted to learn and keep continual improvement. Because from a past employer, and with you having a Japanese background, I'm about to embarrass myself possibly, but wouldn't that be considered dantatsu? I think that, or maybe not. I don't know. There was something at a past employer I worked for where Japanese based company, and they had some of the guiding principles. I think one was like continuous improvement
Mhm.
or simplicity. Don't
Yeah,
overcomplicate things. So
yeah,
I'm probably saying that wrong, but the general point is continually improve and don't get
mhm,
stagnant. Always
mhm,
look for to refine the process.
mhm. Yeah.
So after Masayama saw you, did you then work with him as an apprentice of sorts, or at that point were you kind of on your own? You had enough skill set to kind of pursue as
Um,
as an independent grinder.
when he lent me the wheels, I guess that was him acknowledging that I was ready. And he also let me table with him at the San Francisco Pen Show in 2021. And so he was also able to observe me grinding. He was fine with me going to shows on my own. And he also, like, the only thing he really taught taught me was how to do his cursive italic grind so that customers that he would direct to me would get a similar result. Um,
Okay.
so that's the main one that I learned from him. But most of the other stuff I figured out on my own.
Sorry, I was hitting the wrong button. Very neat. So, I know you have on your website that you do have permission to do the Naginata style grinds. Kind of talk about that. Is that something that was offered to you, or you asked about being able to replicate those? Talk about that because that is unique to kind of have that, you know, the green light to replicate really well
So
known grinds.
because Nagahara had directly shown me how to grind it and he had seen my results, I guess he found me worthy of being associated with his name. And so he asked me to use the same grind names that he does, so that there's no confusion for customers when they get grinds from either of us. And I asked to use his name when labeling them because they are his grinds that his father made. Um, and he was fine with that, with me using his name. So that's how I have that category.
No, and
And
that actually, I was going to say that ties into kind of what I had as the next question. You know, when the first grind, when somebody says Matthew Chen, the first thing that normally comes up is the Kadachi. Is that probably the grind you do the most, that most people come seeking out when they want to grind from Matthew?
it's I don't have hard numbers, but it's a close split between that and the cursive italic because I guess most people are used to cursive italics here, so that's what most people default to, and that's what gives line variation that people sort of expect and want when doing calligraphy or adding flair to their handwriting. Um, Whereas I guess people that want something smoother or with line variation but don't mind it being the architecty type line variation, like the Kodachi. Because in terms of how you use them, crisp italics restrict you from rotating the pen, whereas the Kodachi is meant to work at a lot more angles, so you don't really have that restriction.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I know I have an architect grind of yours. I have a Kadachi and I have an Uranagi. Not
Mm-hmm.
or is that
Yeah,
Yeah, Uranagi. I always get confused on some of the pronunciations,
it's all right.
and you know, it's just interesting how they all write so differently. But what is your favorite nib to grind? Like, if you had to only ever grind one nib, like if you were restricted for some made up reason, what would the one grind that you'd love to continue doing be?
It'd be the Kodachi because that's the one that I spent the most time learning and getting right. So that's the one that I enjoy doing the most. Each time I get it right, it's like, did it again. Hope I
Nice.
made you proud, Mr. Nagara.
No, and that's cool because there was as when we're recording this, St. Louis was what, last weekend, and there was somebody who
Yeah,
was going to their first show, and they were they'd never had, I don't think they'd had anything ground at that point, but I knew that you were on their list, and I was like, oh. From my experience with Matthew, he has tester pins, so you can go up and try all the grinds and then talk to him because he wants to know how you hold the pen and how you're going to use things because he can adapt it depending on your different variables. So in a larger sense, if someone has never had a nib ground, what would just be some general advice you would have for them if they're making an appointment for a bigger show or they're at a smaller show where they can walk up? What kind of questions should they be asking, and what kind of questions would you be asking them so that you are able to grind what they want, so that they're going to have a good writing experience at the end?
I guess one factor is how they change their grip while they write. Because I tend to notice people that write with their fingers tend to manipulate the pen a bit more, so certain grinds may not suit them. Because once you start getting the nibs that have line variation, they sort of restrict how you can hold the pen in one way or another. So grinds that have the thick vertical, thin horizontal, you can't really rotate them too much. Whereas grinds with the thick horizontal and thin vertical, you can't raise or lower it very much. Um, so that's a factor we have to consider. if you want line variation. The other one is if you want a finer line, you are going to get more feedback. That's just how the physics work. You have less material to cushion all the bumps in the paper, so you're going to feel it a lot more. So if you want an ultra fine line, it is not going to be smooth. And if you want something really wide, then it's likely going to be smooth. But it's for figuring out what grind you want, it's best to try the testers. You might find that you like line variation. You might find that you don't like line variation. That's perfectly fine. A lot of the nibs that I use don't really have line variation either. So it's all up to preference. It's always best to test because you don't want to get something and then realize you don't like it. That's always unfortunate. You just wasted your money on something. Be nice if you could sell it off, but that's not always a guarantee. Not everybody likes certain grinds, and it also depends on what grind you got. Not everybody might like that one either. So that's a risk factor. So testing, being able to test is always important. And if you're going to a pen show, I'll have testers. Most nib grinders have testers. Each nib grinder has their own way of doing certain grinds too. It's always good to compare them if you can. But if you can't go to a pen show, it's a little hard. I guess you have to gamble a little bit on whether or not you like the grind or that type of grind. So that's where I recommend just watch how you write and whether or not that grind would fit your writing style.
Okay. And I know one other thing that, talking to people, because the first time I had nibs ground by you in Arkansas, I was buying some new pins, and I was told, go ask Matthew what size nib he should start with,
Oh,
depending
yeah.
on what you want the grind to end up with. So talk
Hmm.
about that a little bit. Of, you don't want to start with a nib necessarily too big if you're taking it down to a needle point. But if
Mhm.
you have to, just kind of talk on that just to help people who are newer, once again, if they've never had a grind or they're going to have an appointment with you coming up at San Francisco or DC or
Mhm.
at the Atlas event in Chicago, just so they kind of have some knowledge of, I want to get a nib ground by Matthew, but I want to get this certain grind. What kind of nib size would they want to start with in general?
Uh, as long as you have more tipping material than you need, it's fine. I don't mind grinding a double broad all the way down to an extra fine if needed. Um, the problem is when you have tipping material that's not big enough for your grind. So as long as the line it puts down is as thick as or thicker than the line variation you want, like the larger line of the line variation you want, that's usually safe. Sometimes, if the tipping material is spherical enough, I can cut to the diameter so it can be a little bit wider. But if you have like one of the Yovo 1.1 stubs that are untipped, those are a little bit more finicky to work on if you don't want that italic type of line variation, just because it doesn't have tipping material to work with.
No, gotcha. And you have your own logo engraved nibs. Do you just have Yovos, or do you also have some box or a mixture? If
I
someone's
just have the
gonna,
Yovos.
okay,
Those are just for people that want realize they want to grind but are unprepared for it. They realize all the pens they have are like mediums, but they needed a double broad for a Kodachi or a Nagi. That's mainly what it's for. I'm not trying to sell nibs as a business. It's just there's a convenience for my customers.
no, I mean that worked for me because I had a pen that I didn't have with me that I wanted an architect. So I was like, oh, it's a Yovo. Just grind one of the ones you have there, and I can put that in my Newton Eastman. Actually, um, something we alluded to earlier. Any pen coming off a line, there's a chance it's going to need some nib work. But are there certain, and I know you might not be able to answer officially, but are there certain brands that are probably going to come to you, out of the box brand new and gonna need tuning?
Uh, some hmm, some European brands, past a certain price point, tend to need nib work. I think how do I say this? The more status symbol type ones, or the fancier ones that seem like they're more for display than for actual writing use, tend to have more nib problems because I guess they sort of expect most of their customer base to not actually use their pens. Or if they do have problems, their warranty system requires you to pay like $150 just for them to look at the pen to see what's wrong. Those are eh, like they're good pens. It's just the tuning. I kind of tune those a lot.
No, and I know you. That's what I was saying. I didn't want to put you in a place where you can't say the brand. You know, you can't say the word Visconti. That might be what I'm thinking, but it's not something you could necessarily say. But it is true. Any pen, be it a cheap Chinese pen, be it a high end pen, QC only goes so far. Because like one of the pens you actually tuned for my wife, she had a great Pelican. I could write fine with it, but it had a slight little catch because when she wrote, it had this slightest little burr that it was only certain people would have that. So that might have passed through quality control because it's working great.
Yeah, it
And
also
except
depends on
for
who's testing it, right?
yeah.
And also, I guess the customer base they expect the pen to use. For example, I have a bunch of vintage Japanese pilot pens, like the pocket pens, and I found a lot of those were tuned to be super dry to the point that you had to press to get any ink to come out. So I wonder if they were used to the Japanese population at that time pressing a lot harder than they do today. And every now and then I find Japanese pens tuned sort of similar, so maybe somebody at the factory is still tuning it the old way.
And that's the interesting thing with pens as a whole is you can get it tuned pretty much exactly down to your preference, and the next person who picks up the pen might be, this I hate how this writes because it's not for them, it's not their pen. It's
Yeah,
but that's kind of cool in a way that you can have exactly, because I know when you were grinding my Kodachi, I was like, can we make it smaller? Can we make it smaller? Because I write small. I wanted it to fit how I
yeah,
planned on using it. And I'm glad I did because now I use it all the time. It's that kind of thing of, less is more. Do a little bit. Try writing with it some. Is this good? No, do a little bit more. Kind of like a haircut. You don't want to take off too much at once because there's a long
yeah.
time before it grows back. So, one other thing that you're commonly known for is if someone sees you at a pen show and you're not grinding nibs behind your booth, is you're walking around with a camera. So I know photography is a big hobby of yours. So just kind of talk about that because, there's some pen shows where you have all these great photos from kind of behind the scenes as you're roaming around. So talk about the photography side of, Matthew Chen and how you kind of got into that and how you've been able to merge that with your nib work and your travel to all these destinations for various pen shows.
So I sort of mentioned back in the day that I was taking art classes, and one of the things that our teacher taught was photography. So, and he sort of got me to use manual lenses. So that's where I kind of got stuck on those. Didn't really like autofocus because you had to take a couple of shots if the autofocus wasn't accurate. Whereas manual, like if it's off focus, it's on me, and if it's on focus, I know. Um, so that's where I wanted to head towards cameras back then. But high school student didn't have the money. Then college student didn't have the money. But now I'm making money with pens, so I do have the money for it. So the first one that I got was the Leica M10, because I'd always wanted a rangefinder, and there's not many digital rangefinders out there. I just wanted that experience because I found it more enjoyable than just looking through a screen on the camera. And I want to do photography to enjoy it. I don't want to turn it into a business because that would suck the fun out of it for me. Um, so that's kind of how I got going with photography as I'm doing now. Um, and I saw people at pen shows that had Leicas because expensive hobby and expensive hobby kind of go hand in hand. Uh, and I just brought it to shows in case I ever saw something interesting I wanted to take a snap of. So that's where some of those photos come from. Um, The sort of unfortunate thing is you go to so many shows and a lot of them start being really similar. You start running out of things to take photos of. So that's why a lot of the more recent photos I've taken or been posting are mostly either just the pens on food or my travels outside of the pen shows.
No, we'll get back to the pins on food because that's a question I have down as well. But aren't you also shooting film now as well? Because don't
Yes,
you have
I
a
am.
film Leica as well?
This is my M6 TTL that I got October last year. And film, when I first started, I was hesitant with film because the whole development thing just seemed like a massive pain in the butt. Um, but it sort of lingered at the back of my head. And finally, I went into film. First color film. I guess it's the slow transition from digital back to film. Um, then I'm in doing black and white photography, um, bulk rolling my own film and developing it myself because I found driving to the store to buy and develop film was getting annoying. It's fun because it's another analog ish adjacent thing, sort of. Of course, digital's not analog, but film is analog. Writing with pens is sort of an analog thing. So I just find that entertaining. Fun hobby, lengthy process thing.
No, and that makes sense because when I did a photography class, either junior or senior year of high school, we're shooting black and white, we're rolling our own film, we're developing our own film. Because color, there's too much more involved, but black and white, you can kind of do it with a basic dark room
Yeah.
and an
Oh, and
enlarger,
these
couple of
days you don't even.
chemicals.
I'm not printing film.
Okay,
I'm scanning. I'm scanning it.
no, it
Cause
still that's even cooler because you get to develop it and then scan it because then you have a lot more flexibility with the
yeah.
technology of film scanners these days versus
Mhm.
in 1997 or 1998. Much different technology
Yeah.
from a scanning
Quite
standpoint.
quite different. Yeah.
So back to the infamous pins and
Depends on
food.
food.
How did that get started?
So before the pens got into food, they were always near food or drinks because that's sort of a trend at the time. My pen friends around me were doing it. And then I went to the Manila Pen Show last year, and they stuck their pens in food. I found that hilarious. I started doing it myself, and so now it's sort of become a meme. Just do it for fun. Some people get a reaction out of it. Um, it's funny, so I like doing it. I do worry every now and then though if the food's too hot, if it might melt the plastic or affect celluloid. So I try
I
to
was
be a
going to
little
say, how do
careful.
you choose? I guess there's not a pin sommelier. How do you choose what's the proper pin to go in the proper dish?
Whatever I have on hand, and as you can see, a lot of the time it's that Hakase.
Yeah, and then of course that's taken a life of its own where now there's pins in drinks. And
Yeah, I kind of avoid the more liquidy liquids because I don't want to clean it out every nook and cranny of my pen. There's some wild people in the Philippines that stick their pens nib down, like open nib down in food, and then the ink gets in there, and then they eat it. I just don't want to clean out food oils from the nib and feed, so that's why I don't do it. But
that's where you
mad
have to
respect to
carry
those that
around your
do.
food pin. So you know you've been doing nib grinding essentially or you've been in the hobby for a decade at this point. You've
Mm.
been grinding, I guess, for you said
Professionally
2019.
since
So
2021 is when my
okay,
business officially started going to pen shows.
how many pin shows are you doing a year these days?
Uh, let's see. Here is my list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 pen
Whew.
shows. Yeah, and that's not including store events. Because I've got Atlas. I did Drum Ghouls. Uh, doing Atlas and Drum Ghouls again. So that's 20 events this year. I know it's Steelers, so 21.
Did you ever imagine when you first said, "Hey, I want to try and fix this nib," it would lead to a traveling around the world to 20 different shows
Definitely
a
not, because I
year?
had no idea there were that many pen shows at the time. All I knew was there's the LA pen show. That was it.
How was it? Or I know it's gonna always depend, but and there's well, sorry, let me rephrase. And anybody who's met you at a show knows that a lot of the time Nina is there as well. And this was a question that people said I should ask: is how did you get into where your mom travels with you and kind of helps run your table? Because everybody loves Nina. You know, how did that kind of come to be where she's become your travel buddy as you're doing shows to kind of keep the list and maintain the list and just kind of help the table move?
The way I operate at shows is pretty much how Masayama operated. He works first come first serve, and he has a wait list for people. And he usually has, on the busier days, he has his wife Emiko handle that list, so he can focus on the grinding. And so if I wanted to do the same thing, I would need somebody to handle that. Otherwise, I'd be wasting time calling somebody or taking down info when I could be grinding. And so I asked mom to help and come along, and I kept doing it. So and then during all the socializations at the shows, I guess she made friends too, and she talks to all the customers while I grind too. So that's how she's kind of more known than me.
No, and that makes sense because I know, in Arkansas, going out to eat before the show started,
Mm-hmm.
my wife and Nina were talking because they ended up sitting next to each other at the table, and then Chad had different things. So just everybody loves that interaction because it's nice to have the friendly face who you might only see once or twice a year,
Mm-hmm.
but they're like you have that recognized. Oh, that's the person I like talking to. This is going to be a good experience. Not to say because that's one thing when you're waiting for something,
Yeah.
it's different as you're testing pins because you're having seen when you grind, you're focused on making sure the grind is right and handing back for trying writing and whatnot. But it's
Mm-hmm.
nice because it's as I was getting nibs ground, my wife was talking to your mom as they're kind of sitting there at the table as the kind of the spectators or the batter's box of sorts waiting for the next grind because you get the text saying, hey, you're going to be next. So
Mm-hmm.
you make your way over and you have someone to kind of you know have a good conversation during that little bit of downtime. So you said you have shows coming up, so I know, and I'll let you kind of talk through. I know you have the Atlas sidewalk sale coming up,
Mm-hmm.
and what pin shows are left for 2025?
There's PNW this weekend, and then DC, San Francisco, and in between DC and San Francisco is the Atlas Sidewalk Sale. Then after San Francisco, I've got Orlando. I went to the Commonwealth show last year, but this year they'd moved the date on top of the Dallas show, so I can't go to the Commonwealth show because I go to the Dallas show. And then I know I listed Colorado, but this year Annabelle's going to be going to Colorado, so I'm not going to go to Colorado, but I'm going to go to the New York show. That's happening for the first time this year. And then I've got Scriptus in Toronto, and then Tokyo. And then after
Very
Tokyo in
cool.
December, I've got another store event at Atlas for the Holiday Expo. And then I should be at Drongul's again after that.
No, and that's just crazy hearing that travel schedule.
Yeah,
But that does make me. It made me think of one other question because you mentioned you go to a lot of shows and you obviously know the other nib grinders. Is there a certain if a new show is starting, what's the number of nib grinders per attendees? Because if there's too many of you, you might not all be able to do a
yeah.
decent show. But is there a certain kind of math that when you talk to your fellow nib grinders, like is it 2 or 3 per show and more than that? There's downtime. Is there kind of a magical number that you kind of coordinate
It's
between
hard
yourselves
to
in some ways?
say because it depends on the customer base. And I guess another metric that somebody mentioned to me was spend per footfall. So you've got a customer base like San Francisco where people spend a buttload of money per person versus some other show where they only spend small amount. Like you could have as many people as you want at that smaller show, but the smaller spend show, but not everybody's going to make much money, or they might not even get nib grinds because people that tend to get nib grinds spend more on their pens or spend more like on the pens in general because they want it to be unique or whichever way they write. So it's hard to say. Like San Francisco, I think we have 8 or 9 grinders in total this time, but I know like we're all gonna be busy the whole day, every day. Whereas DC, I haven't been as busy, and there's not I don't quite as many nib grinders, but still a decent number there. But that goes to show the customer base is sort of the deciding factor, not exactly how many people go, because DC gets a lot of people, San Francisco gets a lot of people, but I get quite different results from both of them.
Okay. That was just one of those things because, I've seen the photos before from different shows where it's all the nib grinders holding up their inky hands at the end of the day and things like that. And
Mhm.
obviously, you each have your own specific grinds that you specialize in your Kadachi. So I would assume, and maybe I'm wrong, but another nib grinder might say, oh, for that type of grind, you'd want to go over to Matthew, where you might refer for this type of grind to someone else. I
Mhm.
don't know if that's the case with nib grinders, but I know in certain specialties, there's if you have one thing that is kind of your bread and butter,
Yeah,
that
like for example,
referring to your
sometimes
counterparts.
sometimes people ask if I can do a journal or grind. I say that's not a grind that I do. Like I can do something similar, but I can't do the exact thing. If you want the exact thing, go to Gina.
Yeah.
We've got our own unique ones. But even with like the standard grinds, we've all got our own way of doing it.
No, and that makes sense. It's like the makers, they all have their kind of specialty, and some makers will be like, you know what, that's not something I make. You need to go talk to this maker for that particular ask and whatnot. So I know you go to shows and you do grinds, but you also accept where someone can mail in a pin to you. So kind of talk through how that works. If someone is not in a area where they can attend a pin show,
Mm.
how can they still get you to take care of one of their nibs, or get one of your custom grinds?
I do take in the work by mail. My website has an order form that's got info on it that you need to send stuff in. And if you have any questions, my email is also on the website. Feel free to email me any questions you have on grinds. I You will need to send in your pen or nib for work. If you don't want to send in the whole pen, there are some pens that do have nib holders for, like Yovo, Bach, and Pelican. But outside of those, I don't have holders for them, so you would have to send in the whole pen if you're fine with that. Um, Current wait time is at 2-ish months on top of pen show delays. Uh, so it, if you want to, like, it's better to get it done at the pen show just because it's faster. But obviously, it's not possible for everyone. So that's where it's at now. that wait time might get longer the busier I get.
Oh, and that makes sense. And I actually had someone who's on one of the discords I'm on was asking about getting a grind, and they're in the Chicago area.
Mhm.
And I was like, wait, Matthew's going to be at the Atlas sidewalk sale, so why don't you try and get an appointment from him instead of mailing one in? Because I guarantee you'll probably get it faster when you can walk up and have him tune it to your writing versus
Oh,
mailing it
definitely.
in.
Yeah, yeah.
So, it's always great. I would prefer in person because getting grinds from you, you're watching how I'm holding the pen. So
Yeah,
a mail out grind is going to be great, but the customization of those little tweaks where you can do a little bit more. Oh, this is just
yeah,
those little bits, if possible. What I think would always be preferred, just as from the
yeah.
consumer standpoint,
Hmm.
and whatnot. So, okay, so Matthew, I just want to say thank you once again for taking some time between your busy pin schedule show, to record an episode. You're the first nib grinder I've had, and that's nice to have some variety in here. And because I have multiple pins, because I think we got 12 pins touched by your grinding skills in
Oh,
Arkansas
dang.
between myself and
Wow.
my wife,
that's
gonna have all
that's a
those
lot.
added up. But So we'll get down to my last question that I've been asking all the guests of what's next for Matthew's Nibworks.
Nothing big, I guess. Just going to more pen shows. I don't really try to do like a next big thing kind of stuff because that's kind of not how I want to run my business. I want it steady and manageable because if I try to do some big hype thing, that's going to be like too much for me to handle. I've seen companies like hype something up and then disappear because they couldn't handle it, or like leave people waiting on pre-orders that never arrive. It's just not something I want to do to my customers. So yeah, I guess maybe trimming one or two shows off of next year because as the workload at home increases, the more shows I go to means less time at home. So I've kind of got to balance that out a little bit. But then nothing real big coming up next.
I just wanted to say thanks again, and we'll have links to Matthew's website, his social media, and whatnot in the show notes. And if you're new to watching, I just want to remind you that we have it on YouTube for video. We also have audio on YouTube, and we're available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. So for now, until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next episode.